not going anywhere without your
scientific method.
Excellent!
Go long. This one's going downtown. Whoa!
Whoa! Now I got a full team. Yeah! Yeah!
Liquid Slam!
Liquid Slam!
Oh!
Throughout the ages, thinkers and politicians from Marx to Mao have sought after and tried without success to find a solution to poverty and inequality. Pythagoras, too, wrestled with the problem of how to achieve equality without trying. In a less free world, he seems to have come closer than Stalin or Castro ever got. Pythagoras was accepted at Croton with ease. His political status in the town was rising, but this was to prove the last truly stable period of his life. Pythagoras concentrated the wisdom and energy that he had gathered during the time he had spent traveling, and created the theories that would be referred to and used for over 2,000 years after his death. Not something that he could have easily visualized. Everyone knew that the world was flat. It was obviously insane to assume otherwise. But Pythagoras discovered that the Earth orbits the Sun rather than the other way around, and the Moon orbits the Earth. He began to edge his way towards the view that the Earth was in fact spherical. He was searching for an explanation as to why the days changed in length and the seasons came and went, but he never reached the final truth.
In the 5th century, Aryabhatta, the great Indian astronomer and mathematician, discussed that the sun is the source of moonlight and studied eclipses. With the help of astronomical and mathematical theories, he advanced his heliocentric theory, which meant that the Earth spun around its own axis and considered planets and their motion with respect to the sun. He calculated the oldest astronomical constant to great accuracy, which gave the ratio of 1,582,237,500 rotations of the Earth to 57,753,336 lunar orbits as 27.3964693,572. He founded a continuous system of counting solar days. He discovered the numerical and geometrical rules for eclipse calculations.
Mere mortals like you and I can understand how the universe works. This was realized long before the Vikings, in ancient Greece. In about 300 BC, a philosopher called Aristarchus was fascinated by eclipses too, especially eclipses of the moon. He was brave enough to question whether they really were caused by gods. Aristarchus was a true scientific pioneer. He studied the heavens carefully and reached a bold conclusion. He realized the eclipse was actually the shadow of the Earth passing over the moon, and not a divine event. Liberated by this discovery, he was able to work out what was really going on above his head and draw diagrams that showed the true relationship of the sun, the Earth, and the moon. From there, he reached even more remarkable conclusions. He deduced that the Earth was not the center of the universe as everyone had thought, but instead orbits the Sun. In fact, understanding this arrangement explains all eclipses. When the Moon casts its shadow on the Earth, that's a solar eclipse. And when the Earth shades the Moon, that's a lunar eclipse.
Eratosthenes, a Greek mathematician and the head of the Library of Alexandria. Eratosthenes had heard that in Syene, a city to the south of Alexandria, no vertical shadows were cast at noon on the summer solstice. The sun was directly overhead. He wondered if this were also true in Alexandria, so on June 21st he planted a stick vertically in the ground and waited to see if a shadow would be cast at noon. It turns out there was one, and it measured about 7 degrees. Now, if the sun's rays are coming in at the same angle at the same time of day, and a stick in Alexandria is casting a shadow while a stick in Syene is not, it must mean that the Earth's surface is curved. Eratosthenes could use his observations to estimate the circumference of the entire planet. Since the difference in shadow length is 7 degrees between Alexandria and Syene, that means the two cities are 7 degrees apart on Earth's 360-degree surface. Eratosthenes hired a man to pace the distance between the two cities, and learned they were 5,000 stadia apart, which is about 800 kilometers. He could then use simple proportions to find the Earth's circumference. 7.2 degrees is 1/50th of 360 degrees, so 800 kilometers times 50 equals 40,000 kilometers.
Copernicus was the father of modern astronomy. Through his observations, he showed that the Earth revolved and the heavens were stationary rather than the other way around. It greatly simplified our knowledge and our understanding of the universe.
He basically took astronomy from a system where we wanted to believe certain things to a system where we could prove that certain things were true.
When Copernicus put the planets going around the sun, he discovered that the planet Mercury, which goes around in about 3 months, automatically fell closest to the sun. And Saturn, the slowest planet, which goes around in about 30 years, automatically fell at the outside edge. Copernicus wrote, "In no other way do we find such a sure harmonious connection between the size of the orbit and its period." That seemed almost magical.
Copernicus also insisted that the Earth was rotating, that it spun completely around on an axis every 24 hours. The heavens didn't move. We did. Stars chasing across the sky each night were merely an illusion created by the rotating Earth. Likely afraid of church reprisals, Copernicus withheld publishing his theory until he was on his deathbed in 1543.
In 1600, William Gilbert, who was a physician to Queen Elizabeth I of England, showed that the force acting on a suspended magnet is not due to the influence of the pole star, but to a magnetic field which is present all over the surface of the Earth, as if the Earth was magnetized. Gilbert made a large spherical ball from magnetite, the poles of which were situated on two opposite ends. By placing a small magnetic compass on this magnetite sphere, Gilbert showed that the compass took up a definite direction at different points on the sphere as it does in the case of the Earth.
Each day, 170 million gigawatts, over 7,000 times the power that humanity consumes, rains down on the surface, triggering a wave of activity that never ceases. The energy given off by the sun. The SDO satellite records the ultraviolet radiation released by our star. Charged particles, fractions of atoms, protons, electrons, and neutrons are constantly thrown out, along with massive pulses of electromagnetic radiation. But occasionally, the sun throws out what's known as a coronal mass ejection. This supercomputer visualization shows a cloud of plasma millions of kilometers wide, racing towards the Earth. If these solar particles were free to hit the Earth's surface, they would do serious damage to any living thing, producing fatal mutations in their DNA. Fortunately, the Earth has a defense. An invisible force field called the magnetosphere surrounds our planet, visualized here in unprecedented detail. These images are generated by data from 5 magnetically tuned satellites. Called Themis, the network of spacecraft reveals the force field as it is constantly bombarded by the sun. As wave upon wave of solar particles strike the magnetosphere, most are deflected. But when a coronal mass ejection arrives, the charged particles peel open the magnetic field's outer layer. The Earth's inner magnetic field steers the radiation towards the poles, triggering one of nature's most remarkable sights. The Northern and the Southern Lights. And here, we can see the Earth's second layer of defense. Giant ribbons of plasma stream downwards, encircling both the North and South poles.
Isaac Newton was born in the village of Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire in eastern England. His father, a farmer, died before he was born. His mother intended him to take over the family farm, but little Isaac was not cut out to be a farmer. At the age of 18, Isaac Newton matriculated at Trinity College in the University of Cambridge in order to study mathematics and philosophy. A few years later, he was appointed Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge, but his interest ranged far wider. Newton concerned himself with a wide range of physical and chemical phenomena, and he himself built the instruments he needed for his research. Using his reflecting telescope, he observed the movements of the planets in the night sky. What could it be, he asked himself, that kept the planets in their elliptical orbits? The natural philosophers, as scientists called themselves in those days, discussed various models which might explain the phenomena. Halley assumed that there must be some central force keeping the planets in their orbits. For Newton, this idea was nothing new. Many years before, while he was still a student, Newton had considered the problem. And without apparent effort, he had come up with a mathematical proof of this force and its effects. But he had never published his results. In fact, he'd almost forgotten them. Halley realized the importance of Newton's work and urged him to set out his theories in a major scientific publication. Newton agreed, and shortly afterwards started work on the Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, a 3-volume work whose publication Halley financed 2.5 years later. Mankind has always been interested in what the Earth looks like and in its place in the universe. Today, everyone knows that the Earth is a sphere and that it rotates on its axis once every 24 hours. Because of the work done by Copernicus, Galileo and Newton, this was generally known to people in the 19th century too. But there was no visual proof, not until one was provided by a man who had been expelled from school and had never obtained a university degree. Jean-Bernard Léon Foucault was born in Paris on the 18th of September 1819, the son of a publisher. In 1851, he demonstrated what was probably his most important experiment, the one with which his name was to become synonymous. The invitation said, "You are invited to watch how the Earth rotates." Scientists had been seeking to prove this for 200 years. They had been dropping weights from towers or into deep wells. Some had even tried to fire cannonballs vertically upwards to detect the slightest deviation from their paths. But every attempt to prove the rotation of the Earth in this way had failed. Jean Foucault was not an academic scientist, but a brilliant experimentalist, craftsman and model maker. Chance also played a role in giving him the idea for his legendary pendulum. He was inspired by a thin steel rod mounted on a fast-turning lathe. When Foucault gave the rod a playful twang, he realized that the plane of vibration did not rotate along with the rod itself. This gave him a brilliant idea. He assumed that the vibrating rod in the rotating lathe behaved just like a swinging pendulum on the rotating Earth. In the basement of his house, he first of all experimented using 2-meter pendulums with a brass weight. On his first attempt, though, on the 3rd of January 1851, the pendulum wire broke before any discernible movement had occurred. But he didn't give up, and 5 days later he was successful. The plane of the pendulum swing seemed to rotate. Foucault informed the Academy of Sciences of his discovery and demonstrated his experiment to the assembled scientists. He was able to show the Earth moving in front of their eyes. According to Newton's law of inertia, a moving body will not alter its direction of motion unless some external force is exerted on it. Once set in motion, therefore, a pendulum will always swing in the same plane. But because the Earth continues its rotation beneath the pendulum, so to speak, an observer will see an apparent change in the pendulum's direction of swing relative to the Earth and the building. To the observer, the rotation is slow but steady. Just as Foucault had predicted, the plane of swing deviates from its original course by about 11 degrees every hour. The deviation per hour or day is dependent on the latitude. At the North or South Pole, it would be precisely 360 degrees per day, because the pendulum would be immediately above the Earth's axis. The further it is away from the pole, the less the rotation. In Paris, it's 264 degrees per day. At the equator, there would be no apparent movement. Following the success of his experiment, Foucault sought a proof of the Earth's rotation that was independent of latitude. A year later, he presented a device which he called a gyroscope, a spinning top whose axis could turn freely in all directions. This meant that it could preserve its orientation in space in all circumstances, whatever the mounting did. The gradual movement of the axis vis-à-vis the Earth can be observed with a microscope. The specific properties of a gyroscope can be usefully applied elsewhere too. For example, the International Space Station, or ISS, uses 4 gyroscopes for stabilization purposes.
Einstein's idle daydreams will profoundly change the way the universe is understood. In 1905, in what's been called his miracle year, he publishes in his spare time 4 visionary papers.
E equals mc squared.
At the simplest level, this means energy can become matter, and matter can become energy. The tiniest speck of matter holds potentially huge amounts of energy. Unleashing it requires a nuclear reaction, the sort going on constantly in the night sky. Today, E equals mc squared is Einstein's most famous equation. But another theory he publishes this same year is more important and more controversial: the special theory of relativity.
In the spring of 1905, Einstein was riding on a bus and he looked back at the famous clock tower that dominates Bern, Switzerland. And then he imagined, what happens if that bus were racing near the speed of light?
In his imagination, Einstein looks back at the clock tower, and what he sees is astonishing. As he reaches the speed of light, the hands of the clock appear frozen in time.
Einstein would later write, "A storm broke in my mind."
Einstein knows that back at the clock tower, time is passing normally. But on Einstein's light-speed bus, as he reaches the speed of light, the light from the clock can no longer catch up to him. The faster he races through space, the slower he moves through time. This insight sparks the birth of Einstein's special theory of relativity, which says that space and time are deeply connected. In fact, they are one and the same, a flexible fabric called space-time.
The relativity paper was published in June 1905.
That volume, number 17, is now one of the most famous publications in the history of science. At the time, Einstein wasn't even a scientist. In 1907, Einstein agrees to write a new article explaining special relativity. But when he re-examines his theory, he finds it seriously limited.
It was called special relativity for a reason, and that was because it really only dealt with moving at constant speeds.
In other words, Einstein's special theory of relativity only applies to a special case, an object moving in one direction at a constant speed. But Einstein wants to understand the real world, and the real world doesn't work that way.
Einstein realized that his theory failed for accelerations. But in our universe, everything accelerates. On a bumpy road, jet airplanes, on a subway car, everything's accelerating. So there was a defect in special relativity.
Einstein knows that for his theory to work, it has to account for everything in the universe. And that includes the pervasive and invisible force that holds everything together.
Gravity. Gravity is everywhere. Gravity holds us to the floor. Gravity holds the sun together, the solar system together. Where was gravity in special relativity?
Einstein wants to expand his special theory of relativity into a general theory of relativity, a theory that will explain not just time, but also gravity. He realizes he will be fighting more than 2 centuries of scientific thought, and his hero, Sir Isaac Newton.
Newton said that if an object falls, it's because there's a mysterious force called gravity pulling it down. But you know, Isaac Newton himself was not satisfied by that. Objects move because they're pushed, not pulled. Objects move because they're pushed. So what is pushing this? Newton didn't know. So Newton simply threw his hands up and said, I don't know. So I'm going to invent something called gravitational pull. And Einstein said, no, this theory can't be right.
Max Planck said to him, you can work on gravity if you want to, but there are 2 problems.
You're not going to be successful. The problem is too hard.
And if you do, no one will believe you.
He's in his office at the patent office, looking out at the window, and he imagined a man working on a roof. And he begins to wonder what would happen if one of those men were to fall off the roof.
And then he had the happiest thought of his life, the inspiration of the ages.
He had a vision. The man will not actually be feeling his own weight.
He would be weightless. And then he imagined, if you're in an elevator and somebody cuts the cord, what happens to you? You fall. But the elevator falls at the same rate you do, so you are weightless inside the elevator. So then Einstein got it.
It's as though gravity's been switched off. What's really going on?
There is no such thing as gravitational pull. The Earth has curved this space around me, and space is pushing me into this chair. Space itself can be curved. Why does the Earth go around the sun? Most people would say, well, the sun's gravity is yanking the Earth toward the sun in a circle. Wrong. The Earth is going around the sun because the sun has warped the space around the Earth, and space is pushing the Earth toward the sun. He had a new theory of gravity, a new theory of the universe.
He could see in ways that no one else could. He put together elements of the universe that others had not imagined would fit together. The general theory of relativity is one of the greatest achievements of the human mind.
If you think about it, the entire modern age, the age of laser beams, telecommunications, satellites, that age was opened up by the work of Albert Einstein. For example, black holes and neutron stars and the Big Bang itself. You cannot describe them adequately without Einstein's theory of general relativity.
It is beautiful and simple and profound. And all the best theories of the universe are just that.
In the early 1930s, the race for space was global. Entrepreneurs, private citizens, and governments were all vying to be the first to fly the highest in the atmosphere. Many succeeded, some perished, but all were voyagers with the same idea: to fly the highest and use the data in order to study what we could not see or touch, the stratosphere. Two of the largest gas balloons ever flown were shipped to a 400-foot deep limestone box canyon named the Stratospheric Bowl, or Stratobowl for short. This site is located just south of Rapid City, South Dakota. The balloons needed to be enormous in order to carry a payload of over a ton of scientific instruments. The smaller of the two balloons was 3 million cubic feet and named Explorer 1. It flew on July 28, 1934 to 60,000 feet above the Earth, then exploded and crashed while Captains William Kempner, Orville Anderson, and Albert Stevens parachuted to safety. That next year, Explorer 2 was built and piloted by Captain Anderson with Captain Stevens as science officer. Larger than Explorer 1 by 700,000 cubic feet, it successfully completed its mission to the world altitude record of 72,395 feet on November 11, 1935. From the Explorer mission, the first photograph of the stratosphere was taken, almost 14 miles above Earth's surface. The flight mission collected scientific data on the composition of air, wind direction and velocity, temperature, pressure, cosmic rays, solar spectrum, and the effects of altitude on radio transmissions. This data produced advances in the use of magnesium alloys, pressurization techniques, and personal equipment such as the heated flying suit. The expedition learned much about the concentration of ozone, the ability for living organisms to survive exposure to stratospheric conditions, and unexpected changes in the radio waves we use to communicate to others. The 1961 Stratolab was an evolutionary stepping stone to space flight, which retained the design of the Explorer gondola, thus bridging the gap between pressurized capsule and the modern spacecraft.
This camera, part of a flying laboratory, is recovered by Clyde Holliday of Johns Hopkins, who prepared it for its trip to the upper stratosphere. Rivaling the fantastic imagination of Jules Verne, the camera brought back a record of a flight into the heavens of a captured German V-2 rocket. At White Sands, New Mexico, the huge missile takes off. Air Force pictures show the rocket in flight, and the flying camera automatically takes over. The huge projectile drops the Earth behind at the tremendous speed of 4,000 feet per second. The rotation of the rocket causes the planet to spin before the lens, and the camera photographs the Earth 65 miles straight down. The horizon, 720 miles away, and the curvature of the Earth are astonishingly apparent in this still picture from the film. An observer in the rocket could have seen San Diego, Salt Lake City, Kansas City, and San Antonio. Approximately 1,600,000 square miles of the Earth's surface was revealed. The rocket reached the 65-mile height in 3 minutes. This giant engine of destruction, designed by Hitler to annihilate Allied nations, now serves the worthy cause of peacetime research.
In October 1957, the Soviets stunned the world by orbiting the first Earth satellite, Sputnik. Sputnik, the world's first satellite, was simplicity itself. An aluminum sphere 23 inches across, polished to reflect sunlight. Inside, a battery pack and basic radio, sending out a repeating pulse. It saw nothing and heard nothing. All it did was coast and beep. Its batteries died after 3 weeks. After 3 months, it fell back into the atmosphere, burned up, and was gone.
We have a saying here when you're nervous about something that you have butterflies in the stomach or butterflies in the tummy. Can you really honestly say that you did not have any butterflies in the tummy before you started?
По-английски есть пословица, что если немножко так не по себе, беспокоишься, то в желудке прыгают бабочки. Можете ли вы заверить всех, что таких бабочек у вас в желудке не было?
Могу заверить.
Yes, I can assure you there were no butterflies, moths, or anything else in my stomach.
Your American astronaut colleague spent an unfortunate 3 or 4 hours in his spaceship before he started off. Did you have a comparable wait before the takeoff?
Will you repeat the latter part of the question, please?
Did you have a comparable wait sitting in the spacecraft waiting for the thing to take off?
Потому что ему пришлось несколько часов провести уже в кабине космического корабля, ожидая запуска. Вам тоже пришлось так понервничать в самом корабле?
Но я не думаю, что само пребывание в кабине космического корабля мое аналогично пребыванию в кабине Меркурия Шепарда.
You see, we were not in the same position, Shepard in the Mercury spaceship and myself in ours.
Несколько часов пребывания, моего пребывания в кабине космического корабля до старта не требовалось.
There was no need for me to spend several hours in the spaceship Vostok before the takeoff.
Это был довольно-таки короткий промежуток времени, в течение которого я, по-моему, вел себя совершенно спокойно, не нервничал. Да что наши ученые могут подтвердить по объективным данным, которые у них получены.
The brief period of time I did spend in the spaceship before the actual takeoff, I think I spent in a quite normal condition, and I think the scientists who were in charge of the flight will confirm this by producing the records, the objective records they have of my pulse count and so on.
Тем более, что повода такого, чтобы волноваться и нервничать, такого повода в это время совершенно не было, как и в течение всего космического полета.
And I don't think there were any grounds for me to be seriously anxious, either at that period or at any time throughout the flight.
You were saying a moment ago, objective records, scientists' objective records, makes me think of something. When are we going to see the color film, which everybody here is most anxiously waiting to see?
Видите ли, мне трудно сказать, когда вы увидите этот фильм, так как это зависит не от меня.
Well, it's difficult for me to give you an exact time because it doesn't really depend on me.
Я могу сказать лишь то, что этот фильм у нас в Советском Союзе уже вышел на экраны и демонстрируется в наших кинотеатрах.
With great success, I should add.
Yes, this film is now being shown in the Soviet Union.
It is?
Yes.
Will you, when you get back home, say, please, we'd like to see it here as quickly as possible?
Прошу вас передать, когда вернетесь домой, что в Англии очень хотят тоже увидеть этот фильм.
Хорошо, я передам.
Yes, I'll be sure to do so.
If we could talk just for a moment about the spacecraft itself. Was the cabin on view at the Tushino Air Show, the one up there on the wall just behind you, was that the actual Vostok?
Кабину в Тушино на авиационном параде не показывали, показывали весь комплекс космического корабля.
The capsule as such was not shown, but the whole spaceship was shown at Tushino.
Я затрудняюсь, был ли этот, сказать, тот самый был ли, или другая модель этого космического корабля, но это точно.
As to the other part of your question, I can't say exactly whether it was the same spaceship or an exact replica.
Could you give us some idea what it's like being in this spaceship, how much room you have in it?
Просторно находиться в таком космическом корабле. Как примерно вы себя чувствовали? Много было места для вас?
Да, в кабине космического корабля очень просторно, гораздо просторнее, чем находиться в кабине самолета.
Yes, it was quite roomy. In fact, it was far roomier than in the cabin of a jet plane.
While we're talking about the ship in flight, there's one small mystery which I think possibly you may be able to clear up for us, but perhaps not, but I'd like to try. On the day when you were making the flight, on the day when Moscow Radio was describing you making the flight, there appeared in our communist newspaper, the Daily Worker, the report that the flight had been made successfully and that the flyer had returned to the Earth. And that report was dated from Moscow the day before. I'm sorry to put this at such length, but this created the impression, of course, that another flight had taken place and you had flown second, and nobody has ever dispelled this yet. Will you do it now?
Могу совершенно компетентно вам заявить, что, очевидно, корреспонденту этой газеты было известно несколько больше, чем тем людям, которые занимаются в нашей стране непосредственно космическими полетами.
Now, I can assure you quite authoritatively that evidently the correspondent of that paper felt he was better informed than the actual people who are in charge of this work in the Soviet Union.
May I have a question?
Такого космического полета не было еще ни у нас в Советском Союзе, не делали такой космический полет и другие государства.
No previous flight of this kind had in fact taken place either in the Soviet Union or in any other country.
Thank you.
Полет, который был совершен 12 апреля, был первым полетом в Советском Союзе, и, собственно, это был первый полет с человеком на борту космического корабля в истории всего человечества.
The flight made on April 12th was the first flight in history of this kind, the first manned space flight ever.
Thank you.
Дорогу к ней продолжает осваивать человек. В Советском Союзе впервые в истории осуществлен выход человека из корабля в космическое пространство. Это подлинные документальные кадры. Они сняты 18 марта 1965 года автоматической кинокамерой, установленной на борту космического корабля «Восход-2». Пилотирует корабль Павел Беляев. Вышел из корабля Алексей Леонов. Человек в межпланетном пространстве. И он живет, работает, улыбается. Значит, люди смогут стыковать корабли, монтировать орбитальные станции, пересаживаться с ракеты на ракету, выходить из аварийных ситуаций. Смелый и важный шаг совершен по пути к Луне. И первыми совершили его советские люди.
"35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Capcom on the hot fire. Okay, all flight controllers going around the horn. Gonna go for undocking. Okay, Retro, go. Fido, go. Guide, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for undocking.
Roger, Eagle, undocked.
Roger, how does it look?
The Eagle has wings.
Roger. Flight controllers, gonna go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guidance, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing. Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. You're looking great.
How you doing, Control? We look good here, fine. How about you, Telcom? Go. Guidance, you happy? Go. Fido, go.
2,000 feet. 2,000 feet. Into the ag. 47 degrees. Roger. 37 degrees.
Still looking very good.
Your go. Stop alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm.
1201 alarm.
Same type, we're go, flight.
Okay, we're go.
We're go, same type, we're go.
Altitude 1,600.
Eagle looking great. Roger, 1202, we copy it. 35 degrees, 750, coming down to 23. 540 feet and a 15. 350 feet down at 4. Altitude, velocity, light. 3.5 down, 220 feet. 11 forward, coming down nicely, 200 feet. 4.5 down, 5.5 down. 100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. Okay, 75 feet. Car's looking good, down a half. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on, forward. Forward. 40 feet, down 2.5. Picking up some dust. Straight shadow. 4 forward, drifting to the right a little. 30 seconds. Forward, just. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Mr. Armstrong, I do realize that when you were on the moon, you had very little time for gazing upwards. But could you tell us something about what the sky actually looks like from the moon, the sun, the earth, the stars, if any, and so on?
The sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon. The Earth is the only visible object other than the sun that can be seen, although there have been some reports of seeing planets. I myself did not see planets from the surface, but I suspect they might be visible. The Earth is quite beautiful from space and from the moon. It looks quite small and quite remote, but it's very blue and covered with white lace and of the clouds, and the continents are clearly seen, although they have very little color from that distance.
What about the sun? Could you see any trace of the corona?
No, the glare from the sun on the helmet visor was too difficult to pick out the corona. The only time we could see the corona was during an eclipse of the sun from the moon, that is when we were flying through the moon's shadow and could observe the solar corona peeking out from behind the moon.
I have two brief questions I'd like to ask, if I may. When you were carrying out that incredible moonwalk, did you find that the surface was equally firm anywhere, or were there harder and softer spots that you could detect? And secondly, when you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
In rather flat regions, the footprint would penetrate perhaps a half an inch or sometimes only a quarter of an inch and gave a very firm response. In other regions near the edges of these craters, we could find that the foot would sink down maybe 2, 3, possibly 4 inches. And in the slope, of course, the various edges of the footprint might go on up to 6 or 7 inches, and compacting this material would tend to produce a slight sideways motion as it was compacted on the material underneath it. So we feel that you cannot always tell just by looking at the terrain what the exact resistance will be as your foot sinks into a point of firm contact. So one must be quite cautious in moving around in this rough terrain.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see. I don't remember seeing any.
Neil, you were a little bit concerned, you said, about stubbing your toe at the point of landing because the surface was obscured by dust.
Engine arm is S. Okay, I'm going to get to pro. 99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Beds are good. Ag saw it. Pitch over. Roger, you have good thrust. Okay, 30 seconds. 308 your number. Okay, coming through 1,500 feet, and H-dot looks good.
I mean, do you have Neil Armstrong interviewed already?
No, he doesn't want to be interviewed.
Well, I know.
Why does he not give interviews?
Well, because that's his personal choice. and I guess it's mine in a way to do things when they've been researched and worked out as far as a business arrangement. This is not news. This is not an anniversary.
Well, actually it is. We found a very unique reel of footage that we have queued up to show you.
Yeah.
And it's from the mission. And to our knowledge, no one has ever seen it before.
Mm.
And it's 30 years old.
And you want me to see this while you have me on camera?
Well, and to tell us what it is. I mean, it's...
Well, I don't know why I should do that.
It's a very unique footage.
It may be that I need to see it, and then we sit down and we talk about what you're taking a picture of. I don't see where there's an advantage in it for me to do what you're asking me to do. I see all sorts of pitfalls. I see people who have managed to talk to somebody. Who did you talk to in our office?
I talked with Heather at Tor Books.
Yeah, but is this helping book promotion? Are you going to be putting anything out during the time that I'm marketing books? See, Heather does not represent me for the things you're talking about. She represents a book selling activity.
I think when you see the footage, you'll see that it's very extraordinary, one of a kind, behind the scenes type of footage.
Yeah. Well, if it is, why do you have access to something that no one else has seen before?
Serendipity, I guess. And it was recorded on the 18th
of what?
Of July, 1969. Do you remember this?
On the 18th?
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light. We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera. South America becomes invisible just off beyond the terminator or inside the shadow. We can see the oceans with a definite blue cast, see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
Roger, the ATC is working real well. The F-22 looks good, over. Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, did you copy, over?
Roger, we copied that, Charlie.
Roger, your transmissions the last couple of times have been about 2 by, over.
Okay, how do you read me now?
Right, you're 5 by now. Now we're coming in. Can't quite make out who that had.
What is your proposition? That we didn't go to the moon?
I know for a fact that you did. I know for a fact that you did not.
You know for a fact that we did not.
That's correct, and you'll see this tape proves that.
Okay, well, I'm not interested in satisfying your suppositions when there's all this evidence that we did.
This proves, as you see, that you were using the window to demonstrate that you were halfway to the moon when you were
Turn the camera off, please. Turn the camera off.
Through the other windows.
You're full of shit.
It shows that you're in Earth orbit. Now, if the moon is 3 days away, and this is late, on the 18th, how could you possibly walk on the moon 2 days later when this was shot on the 18th?
You want me to sit in front of a camera while you're taking pictures, you're showing this, and then you want to see my reaction?
I know for a fact
that's slimy journalism. Do you realize that?
If
you ought to be ashamed of yourself.
If you read the document that I have in here, you'll find that it's not. That this is a personal plea to do what is right.
Well, we sit and we talk about things ahead of
This is the
time.
document that you'll want to see. I know for a fact.
But what it is you're trying to do is unethical. You don't believe that?
No, I do not.
Well, then we have a difference of opinion.
This is where you're using the window of the spacecraft to appear to be the Earth far away. We got the raw footage of it. We have an auxiliary track, someone prompting you when to speak.
You believe in UFOs?
No, I do
believe
not.
we've been visited by... Well, why do
No, I
you want to
don't.
believe this stuff?
I know for a fact. We've had this analyzed, and this is the window, and you're in, and it's dated by an atomic clock at the Goldstone tracking station, which is on the tape.
Well, you're
Says
talking to
that
the wrong guy. Why
you
don't
were
you
there.
talk to the administrator at NASA? We're passengers. We're guys going on a flight. We're not...
I know for a fact that it didn't. And this tape would prove it in a court of law. It would.
Why don't you try? Why don't you put your money into a court of law and see how people laugh at you? You want it...
No one has
Is your
laughed.
camera working?
No one has laughed.
And this makes you the real famous person that has discovered this and reveals all this stuff. What an ego you must have to want to propel yourself like this.
That's not why I'm doing it, and God knows that's not why I'm doing it. I'm doing it for the truth to come out because I think it was wrong.
You can also notice how the astronauts
But you're doing it the wrong way. You don't mislead somebody like me to come in here.
If you didn't go to the moon, that's misleading people. I'm showing you this
Okay,
tape.
we went to the moon. We're not misleading anybody.
Then how is it possible that this is the window? It's shot to make it look like.
Look, you can manufacture all you want with
This
these
is
things.
straight. This isn't manufactured.
Sure.
You know that it
to
isn't.
that of an interior of the astronauts at work.
I believe this would prove it in a court of law that you did not go to the moon. It's dated on the 18th. It proves when you remove the
You
crystal.
give me your
Here's
business
the light.
card.
It's all in there.
Camera controls,
It's all
but
in there.
not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert.
This proves that it's the window. You can see them removing the crescent insert that you did to create the Terminator line in front of
You're
the
so
window.
full of shit, I can't believe it. If you show this publicly, you're open for a lawsuit. Okay?
Mr. Collins, Bart Sibrel, ABC Digital.
How are you?
Good. I'm the gentleman who found the classified tape from your mission of you faking the window shot, putting the transparency over the window when you were supposedly halfway to the moon when in fact you were in Earth orbit.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I think you must be some kind of wacko.
Okay, well, we have the opportunity to set the record straight.
Well,
We're asking you to...
I'm not on the record right now.
Would ask you to...
Would you please go away?
Well, asking you to swear in the Bible that you orbited the moon.
Would you please go away?
Well, if you really orbited the moon, why won't you swear in the Bible that you did so? Can you tell me why you would have a problem doing that?
Would you please go away?
You don't remember the shot where you put the transparency over the window? We have it being done up to about 10 hours before they supposedly walked on the moon. I just don't understand why if you orbited the moon you wouldn't have a problem about swearing to the Bible on it. Can you tell me why? Are you afraid for the truth to come out?
I think you're some kind of wacko. I really do.
Well, I think it's wacky to not swear to God on something that's supposed to be obvious.
been bad. Don't tell me different, no it's a lie. Come to me, honey, see how I cry. Why must you hurt me, do what you do? Listen here, girl, can't you suck you? Make a little effort, try to be true. I'll be happy, not so blue.
And when you're in space and you're looking into deep space and you're on the sun side of the orbit, the sunlight washes out all the starlight, so you can't see any stars, just like here on Earth. But then when you look out into deep space away from the sun, it's the darkest black you can imagine. It's the darkest black you can imagine.
And when you look to your right, there's the whole universe, just right there, going on forever. Just the inherent beauty of it, the velvet, bottomless bucket of the universe. It's just this glowing, raging explosion of color in like just hanging there in a vast sea of darkness, and the most frightening darkness that you could ever imagine.
All this bright material, you know, the Earth, the bright white sun in a black sky, huge spacecraft above me, the bright white sun in a black sky.
Vast sea of darkness.
A lot of lights out there. There are a lot of stars, and they're all fixed relative to each other. There are a lot of stars.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know, but I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened. And if it didn't happen, it's nice to know why it didn't happen, so in the future, if we want to keep doing something, we need to know why something stopped in the past that we wanted to keep it going.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the
darkest
moon.
black you can
The
imagine.
darkest black you can imagine.
Sky
Velvet.
is
It's
bottomless black.
Bright white sun in a black
It's
When
the
viewed
darkest
from
black
the
you
moon.
can imagine. And when you're in space and you're looking into deep space and you're on the sun side of the orbit, the sunlight washes out all the starlight, so you can't see any stars like here on Earth.
One of truth's protective layers.
The sunlight washes out all the starlight.
A copy of the book, The Lighthouses of the World, and a calculator are enough to prove that the Earth is not a globe, but an extended flat plane. The distance from which various lighthouse lights around the world are visible at sea far exceeds what could be found on a globe Earth 25,000 miles in circumference. NASA and modern astronomers claim we are living on an oblate spheroid 25,000 statute miles in equatorial circumference with a curvature of 7.935 inches to the mile, varying inversely as the square of the distance, meaning in 3 miles there is a declination of nearly 6 feet, in 30 miles 600 feet, in 300 miles 60,000 feet, and so on. Therefore, if we wish to prove or disprove the validity of their convexity claim, it is a fairly simple, straightforward matter of measurements and calculations. For example, the Dunkirk light in southern France, at an altitude of 194 feet, is visible from 28 miles away. Spherical trigonometry dictates that if the Earth was a globe with the given curvature of 8 inches per mile squared, this light should be hidden 190 feet below the horizon. The Port Nicholson light in New Zealand is 420 feet above sea level and visible from 35 miles away, which means it should be 220 feet below the horizon. The Errigo light in Norway is 154 feet above high water and visible from 28 statute miles, where it should be 230 feet below the horizon.
first started researching flat Earth theory, one of the first things I had to accept if I was going to even think about the possibility would be that NASA and all of the photographs or composites, as they are actually called, or in video, whatever you want to call it, from space is fake. And I mean, that's a giant leap you have to take to to accept something like this, or to even consider it. And so I started watching videos that people had produced showing that the ISS was a hoax, and you know, that satellites were fake. A lot of people, there were videos showing that on spacewalks, when it looked like they're on space, people caught a bubble rising from an astronaut's helmet, or a guy with a scuba tank inside the ISS in a window, and just other things like that. And so I first started seeing that stuff, and it was pretty convincing, but at the same time, I thought, well, it's not definitive proof, because how do I know that this stuff hasn't been edited in to sway opinions, because there are people out there that believe the Earth is flat and they want everybody else to believe it too. So I remained skeptical, but I also was doing my own little experiments on Earth with binoculars and just seeing how far I could see over the horizon, and drawing distances in AutoCAD and doing calculations and finding that I was able to see things much farther away, and observing the sun and the moon and the stars and things like that. And so you know, my opinion started to sway a little bit, but I still was trying to prove it wrong. But I'll never forget the moment that everything clicked. And that was on a Friday night. I was just watching videos, doing my typical thing, you know, just wondering, you know, trying to prove these things wrong that I was seeing. And I don't remember what video it was, but the narrator in the video said, you know, how are there satellites and a space station in the thermosphere layer of the atmosphere when the temperature gets up to 2,000 degrees Celsius? And that's when everything clicked. I remembered, oh wow, I remembered from astronomy, my professor talking about the temperature in the thermosphere. And I remember her taking a marker like this and holding it out, and held it in front of the class like this, and she said, the temperature in the thermosphere layer of the atmosphere is upwards of 2,000 degrees Celsius, or can get up to upwards of 2,000 degrees Celsius. But you can't actually measure the temperature, because the gas particles in the thermosphere are spread so far apart that there are not enough of the particles collide with the tip of the thermometer to make it show a hot temperature, because heat is actually kinetic energy. And a thermometer works by measuring basically the collisions, the energy being transferred to it, and that's why it shows you what the actual temperature of the liquid or the air or whatever is. And so I remembered sitting in class and thinking to myself, well, how did they measure the temperature in the first place? How do we know it's 2,000 degrees Celsius if you can't measure it? And I thought about maybe thermal imaging or something, but still you have to be measuring that kinetic energy. So it didn't make sense to me. But at the time, I didn't put two and two together and realize that that's where the majority of LEO, which are low Earth orbit satellites, and the International Space Station and the Space Shuttle used to be. You know, what they used to, or the Space Shuttle used to be, but everything else orbits the Earth. And so when that hit me, I said, wait a second, this can't be. It just doesn't add up. So think about this one. Think about this being real or not. Ask yourself, do you really think they're up there? Go watch ISS footage. Go look at pictures of satellites. Ask yourself why when they're out on spacewalks, they never see the thousands of satellites that are supposed to be up there. You never see one go whizzing by. Or why they never, when they're inside the station, they don't show off more and show us the void of space from inside the station with a camera looking out. You know, there's just not enough. I don't see enough.
In the mid-19th century, a Frenchman named Leon Foucault became famous for swinging pendulums and claiming their consequent motions were proof of the Earth's diurnal rotation. Since then, Foucault pendulums have regularly been swinging at museums and exposition halls worldwide, purporting to provide everlasting perpetual proof of the heliocentric spinning ball Earth theory. The truth is, however, unbeknownst to most of the duped public, that Foucault's pendulum is a failed experiment which proves nothing but how easy it is for pseudoscience to deceive the malleable masses. Lady Blunt says, "This pendulum, modern scientists tell us, affords a visible proof that we are living on a whirling globe, which, according to a work on science, now before me, is spinning upon its so-called axis at the rate of over 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, and in addition to other motions is rushing on an everlasting tour around the sun, the diameter of which is said to be 813,000 miles, and its weight 354,936 times greater than the Earth, from which it is said to be about 93 million miles distant, at the rate of over 1,000 miles per minute. Now, to prove that the Earth really has these motions, a pendulum is suspended at the show. The showman sets motion, and bids the gaping world of thoughtless men and women to behold a proof that we are living on a whirling globe which is rushing away through space." William Carpenter says, "Astronomers have made experiments with pendulums which have been suspended from the interior of high buildings, and have exulted over the idea of being able to prove the rotation of the Earth on its axis by the varying direction taken by the pendulum over a prepared table underneath, asserting that the table moved round under the pendulum, instead of the pendulum shifting and oscillating in different directions over the table. But, since it has been found that, as often as not, the pendulum went round the wrong way for the rotation theory, chagrin has taken place of exultation, and we have a proof of the failure of astronomers in their efforts to substantiate their theory." So to begin with, Foucault's pendulums do not uniformly swing in any one direction. Sometimes they rotate clockwise, and sometimes counterclockwise. Sometimes they fail to rotate, and sometimes they rotate far too much. Scientists who have repeated variations of the experiment have conceded time and again that, quote, "it was difficult to avoid giving the pendulum some slight lateral bias at starting. The behavior of the pendulum actually depends on 1. The initial force beginning its swing, and 2. The ball and socket joint used, which most readily facilitates circular motion over any other. The supposed rotation of the Earth is completely inconsequential and irrelevant to the pendulum's swing. If the alleged constant rotation of the Earth affected pendulums in any way, then there should be no need to manually start pendulums in motion. If Earth's diurnal rotation caused the 360-degree uniform diurnal rotation of pendulums, then there should not exist a stationary pendulum anywhere on Earth." Samuel Rowbotham says, "First, when a pendulum constructed according to the plan of Mr. Foucault is allowed to vibrate, its plane of vibration is often variable. Not always. The variation, when it does occur, is not uniform, is not always the same in the same place, nor always the same either in its rate or velocity, or in its direction. It cannot therefore be taken as evidence, for that which is inconstant cannot be used in favor of or against any given proposition. It therefore is not evidence and proves nothing. Secondly, if the plane of vibration is observed to change, where is the connection between such change and the supposed motion of the Earth? What principle of reasoning guides the experimenter to the conclusion that it is the Earth which moves underneath the pendulum, and not the pendulum which moves over the Earth?" Also in the mid-19th century, another Frenchman named Gaspard Gustave Coriolis performed several experiments showing the effect of kinetic energy on rotating systems, which have ever since become mythologized as proof of the heliocentric theory. The Coriolis effect is often said to cause sinks and toilet bowls in the northern hemisphere to drain spinning in one direction, while in the southern hemisphere causing them to spin the opposite way, thus providing proof of the spinning ball Earth. Once again, however, just like Foucault's pendulums spinning either which way, sinks and toilets in the northern and southern hemisphere do not constantly spin in any one direction. Sinks and toilets in the very same household are often found to spin in opposite directions, depending entirely upon the shape of the basin and the angle of the water's entry, not the supposed rotation of the Earth. Jennifer Horton wrote, While the premise makes sense that the Earth's eastward spin would cause the water in a toilet bowl to spin as well, in reality, the force and speed at which the water enters and leaves the receptacle is much too great to be influenced by something as minuscule as a single 360-degree turn over the span of a day. When all is said and done, the Coriolis effect plays no larger a role in toilet flushes than it does in the revolution of CDs in your stereo. The things that really determine the direction in which water leaves your toilet or sink are the shape of the bowl and the angle at which the liquid initially enters the bowl.
Right, this is the reason I made this little video. Just watch this.
I definitely haven't mastered it. I'll give you a trial and I'll show you just how bad it is.
That was great.
Practice makes perfect. Give me another week.
Let's see that again, slow motion. Zero gravity, they're trying to say? That is not zero gravity. This one's slowed down even more. Unbelievable. And watch this, he waves goodbye like he's some sort of children's TV presenter.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Tim. Keep up the good work.
I mean, you don't need to be clever to see that's complete hoax, that's complete fake. I mean, you just need a tiny bit of intuition. You don't even need the logic. I mean, that is complete fakery. And why would they do it? Why would they do that? Because they're hiding the fact that the Earth's flat.
There is a popular myth taught to school children, which most adults today still believe, that people in history have traveled in perfectly straight lines, eastwards or westwards, and eventually arrived back at their starting point. It is heralded as proof of the globe Earth, and claimed that hundreds of adventurers since Magellan have completed such successful circumnavigations, but the truth is that no one in history has ever set off traveling in a perfectly straight line and returned back at their starting point. All successful circumnavigations in history, whether by sea or air, have instead followed the same pattern, which is sailing or flying the most convenient route from port to port, stopping for supplies and refueling until a complete circle has been made. Not a single sailor or aviator in history has or could travel only in the same one perfectly straight direction and magically arrive back where they began. This ridiculous lie becomes obvious when critically examined, but when taught to young children, successfully bends and warps their minds into accepting globe indoctrination. Unlike the cardinal directions on a compass rose, north, south, east, and west on Earth are not simply straight lines separated by 90 degrees. North, rather than being an upward shooting arrow, is actually a point, a center point, the center point of the entire Earth, known as the geographic North Pole, situated directly below Polaris, the North Pole star, the only motionless star in the heavens, which marks the exact northern center point of the sky. South, rather than being a downward shooting arrow, is actually every line tangent to the northern center point, or in other words, every straight line extending outwards from the North Pole heads due south. East and west, rather than being right and left facing arrows, are actually clockwise and counterclockwise circles around the pole. The sun, moon, and stars all rise in the east and set in the west, making perfect circles over and around us every day. As you can observe, they travel in a circular westward path over and around the Earth, and do not all travel in a straight leftward direction as suggested by a compass rose. Likewise, navigators since ancient times have used Polaris to guide their ships, knowing that Polaris was the heavenly North Pole, south was traveling keeping your back to Polaris, east meant traveling keeping your left shoulder 90 degrees to the pole star, and west meant traveling keeping your right shoulder 90 degrees to the pole star. All circumnavigations in history have been eastwards or westwards, and never northwards or southwards, because the latter is geographically impossible. Likewise, southern hemisphere flights from Australia to South America, or New Zealand to South Africa, for example, never fly the shortest, most direct route on a globe, which would be southwards over Antarctica. It is claimed this is because such flights would allegedly be too cold for any airplanes to handle. But the reality is the routes are geographically impossible because Antarctica is not a tiny ice continent confined to the underside of a spherical spinning ball Earth. Antarctica is actually the outer southern perimeter of our level, motionless plain Earth and surrounds the other 6 continents. How far southwards Antarctica actually extends, and how it terminates, or what exists beyond it, are all unknown to and kept from the general public, however, and as a result, no completely accurate, fully functioning flat Earth map exists or could exist without the people being first allowed full, independent exploration of the Arctic, Antarctic, and everywhere else. There are, however, several maps which work as good visual aids for approximating the geography of our flat stationary Earth. The Gleason's 1892 New Standard Map of the World and Hammond's 1945 Air Age Map of the World are 2 such maps. These so-called azimuthal equidistant maps are used in practical navigation and can be found in the logos of the United Nations, World Health Organization, International Maritime Organization, and International Civil Aviation Organization. They purport these to be simply 2-dimensional representations of a spherical Earth with the North Pole at the center point, and claim these maps were made by flattening the globe. But just the opposite is true, and the globe, specifically the so-called continent of Antarctica, was made by spherizing our flat Earth and bundling the expansive outer perimeter into a cramped, oddly shaped ice continent under the ball, kept off limits by treaty from the general public.
Well, now, one thing, you have a theory about the moon, and we expect to be able to get observable facts about the moon fairly soon. What is your theory?
Well, it is by now rather more than a theory. 10 or 11 years ago, I stated to various scientists that the moon is not a piece of rock, but it is a plasma phenomenon, cosmic plasma, and that this fact will eventually be confirmed. I made certain predictions which were already confirmed in 1958, and the situation now is coming close to a complete confirmation.
What will be the result if you're proved to be correct in your theories?
The result will be profound and decisive, because it will give proof that a complete reinvestigation of the laws of nature is necessary. Because if the moon is a plasma, no man will ever land on it. The soft landing attempts will all fail. That means that the mass of the moon is less, far less, than is currently assumed. It's in a different state of energy, and it has far less mass. That means there is no more explanation for the tides. If the moon, for example, had only 1,000th part of its current mass, then the tides would only be 2 inches high, and the conventional theories instead of sometimes 14 feet. And that means that if it is proved that the moon is a plasma, then all gravitational theories are out, and a new concept of the cosmos.
NASA and modern astronomy maintain that the moon is a solid, spherical, Earth-like habitation which man has actually flown to and set foot on. They claim the moon is a non-luminescent planetoid which receives and reflects all its light from the sun. The reality is, however, that the moon is not a solid body. It is clearly circular, but not spherical, and not in any way an Earth-like planetoid which humans could set foot on. In fact, the moon is largely transparent and completely self-luminescent, shining with its own unique light. The sun's light is golden, warm, drying, preservative, and antiseptic, while the moon's light is silver, cool, damp, putrefying, and septic. The sun's rays decrease the combustion of a bonfire, while the moon's rays increase combustion. Plant and animal substances exposed to sunlight quickly dry, shrink, coagulate, and lose the tendency to decompose and putrefy. Grapes and other fruits become solid, partially candied and preserved, like raisins, dates, and prunes. Animal flesh coagulates, loses its volatile gaseous constituents, becomes firm, dry, and slow to decay. When exposed to moonlight, however, plant and animal substances tend to show symptoms of putrefaction and decay. In direct sunlight, a thermometer will read higher than another thermometer placed in the shade, but in full, direct moonlight, a thermometer will read lower than another placed in the shade. If the sun's light is collected in a large lens and thrown to a focus point, it can create significant heat, while the moon's light, collected similarly, creates no heat. In the Lancet Medical Journal from March 14, 1856, particulars are given of several experiments which proved the moon's rays, when concentrated, can actually reduce the temperature upon a thermometer more than 8 degrees. Dr. Samuel Robotham wrote, "The sun's light, when concentrated by a number of plane or concave mirrors, throwing the light to the same point, or by a large burning lens, produces a black or non-luminous focus, in which the heat is so intense that metallic and alkaline substances are quickly fused, earthy and mineral compounds almost immediately vitrified, and all animal and vegetable structures in a few seconds decomposed, burned up, and destroyed. The moon's light, concentrated in the above manner, produces a focus so brilliant and luminous that it is difficult to look upon it, yet there is no increase of temperature. In the focus of sunlight there is great heat, but no light. In that of the moon's light there is great light, but no heat." David Wardlaw Scott wrote, "Light which is reflected must necessarily be of the same character as that which causes the reflection. But the light of the moon is altogether different from the light of the sun. Therefore the light of the moon is not reflected from the sun. The sun's light is red and hot, the moon's pale and cold. The sun's dries and preserves certain kinds of fish and fruit, such as cod and grapes, for the table, but the moon's turns such to putrefaction. The sun's will often put out a coal fire, while the moon's will cause it to burn more brightly. The rays of the sun focused through a burning glass will set wood on fire, and even fuse metals, while the rays of the moon, concentrated to the strongest power, do not exhibit the very slightest signs of heat. I have myself long thought that the light of the moon is electric, but, be that as it may, even a board school child can perceive that its light is totally unlike that of the sun. So sunlight and moonlight clearly have altogether different properties, and furthermore, the moon itself cannot physically be both a spherical body and a reflector of the sun's light. Reflectors must be flat or concave for the light rays to have any angle of incidence. If a reflector's surface is convex, then every ray of light points in a direct line with the radius perpendicular to the surface, resulting in no reflection. Dr. Samuel Robotham wrote, "Again, if the moon is a sphere, which it is declared to be, how can its surface reflect the light of the sun? If her surface was a mass of polished silver, it could not reflect from more than a mere point. Let a silvered glass ball or globe of considerable size be held before a lamp or fire of any magnitude, and it will be seen that instead of the whole surface reflecting light, there will be a very small portion only illuminated. But the moon's whole surface is brilliantly illuminated, a condition or effect utterly impossible if it be spherical." The Bible also attests that the moon is self-luminescent and not a mere reflector of sunlight in Genesis 1:16, where it states that God made two great luminaries, the greater luminary to rule the day, and the lesser luminary to rule the night. Not only is the moon clearly self-luminescent, shining its own unique light, but it is also largely transparent. NASA photoshoppers claim the moon is a dark, spherical planetoid, yet with our own eyes, or through a telescope, we can see it is actually a bright, circular, semi-transparent luminary. On a clear night, during a waxing or waning cycle, it is even possible to occasionally see stars and planets directly through the surface of the moon. On March 7, 1794, 4 astronomers, 3 in Norwich, 1 in London, wrote in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Astronomical Society, that they, quote, saw a star in the dark part of the moon, which had not then attained the first quadrature, and from the representations which are given, the star must have appeared very far advanced upon the disk. Sir James South of the Royal Observatory in Kensington wrote a letter to the Times newspaper, April 7, 1848, that, quote, on the 15th of March, 1848, when the moon was 7½ days old, I never saw her unillumined disk so beautifully. On my first looking into the telescope, a star of about the 7th magnitude was some minutes of a degree distant from the moon's dark limb. I saw that its occultation by the moon was inevitable. The star, instead of disappearing the moment the moon's edge came into contact with it, apparently glided on the moon's dark face, as if it had been seen through a transparent moon.
So let's say we're looking down on the North Pole of the globe Earth, and the Earth is rotating, spinning, or I should say rotating. People have given me some criticism for, I should say, rotating instead of spinning, because they've said it's being deceptive to say spinning, but I mean, spinning, rotating, I really think it's the same thing. So anyway, Earth is rotating, right? And so let's say we're going to freeze the Earth at that moment. Freeze the Earth with the atmosphere around it, assuming that the atmosphere is rotating with the Earth. And that's what I have drawn on the board here. Okay? So here's the Earth down here. All right, and let's say that this line right here is the equator. When you're looking down on it, the equator is right here. Okay, so we're just going to say this line is the equator, and then this is the edge of the atmosphere up here, and then there's space out here. Now this is obviously not the scale, this is just conceptual. Okay, and so at the equator, the circumference of the Earth is roughly 25,000 miles. And so to figure out the instantaneous velocity of the Earth as it spins around its axis on the equator, you divide the circumference by the time it takes to make one revolution, which is 24 hours. And when you do that, you get roughly 1,038 miles per hour. Okay? And so we assume right here that this is the Earth rotating at 1,038 miles per hour. And I said in the video, and people have said in the comments, that you can just say that that's zero. Okay? And so what I want to do is look at this atmosphere and look at 3 points and 3 elevations, okay? A, B, and C, and assume that we're looking at just 1 cubic foot of air, okay? Just to get our minds around this volume of air that's frozen in time right now, okay? So all of it's moving, all the air is moving with the Earth in such a way that it appears relatively stationary. You know, we go outside, wind blows and moves around, but it's all moving with the Earth, and that's what slows the plane down, because the atmosphere moves with the Earth, okay? So point A, point B, and point C, all moving with the Earth. I mean, they could be blowing this way, they could be blowing down at this moment, but since we froze them, we know that it's all moving with the Earth and not getting left behind, right? That's the assumption. And so we will say at this moment we expect all of these points of air to make one complete revolution and come back to the same spot in 24 hours, right? Because the atmosphere moves with the Earth. The atmosphere never gets left behind. So right off the bat, since we know the velocity is equal to distance divided by time, we can say that VA, the velocity of point A, is greater than the velocity of point B, which is greater than the velocity of point C. Because point A has a longer distance to travel in 24 hours than point B, and point B has a longer distance than C, because the circumference of their path is greater, right? So I've got A up here at the edge of the atmosphere, space up here, B right here around 6 miles where planes fly, and C near the surface of the Earth, okay? And so this rotation here, the theory is that the Earth is rotating about its axis because of the Big Bang. When you really think about it, there was this Big Bang, everything exploded out into space, planetary systems formed, galaxies, all that stuff formed, and this rotation is what is left over from that explosion. That's leftover energy from that explosion of the creation, which created everything, right? And so everything's just been moving for billions of years, and there's no friction between space and the atmosphere, right? Because there's nothing in space, so an object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an outside force, right? But that's kind of strange when you think about that air at higher elevations has to be moving faster to keep up with the ground below it, because air moves up and down, right? Hot air rises, as we know, and cool air sinks, right? So how does the air speed up? When it's heated, it rises, but then it has to start moving faster. Now, even if it's only a little bit faster, the difference in these velocities, if you calculate them, isn't much, but they do have to be greater, or they will start to get left behind. So, how that is explained, I don't know. I haven't really found anything to talk about how the air has to be moving faster. But another thing to think about is, air isn't stationary like we're assuming in this problem, right? It blows, it moves all over the place, and down here at the surface, air goes up and down over valleys, and air actually speeds up as it goes up and as it goes over the top of a hill. It speeds up, it slows down, runs into mountains, goes through trees. There's things flying around in the air, different pressures. All kinds of stuff is happening internally as it all moves with the atmosphere. Now, I would think that eventually something's going to have to give it a nudge to keep it moving with the Earth, so to say. The energy would be lost, okay? But not to mention that, there are things that enter our atmosphere. There's meteors, all kinds of stuff is constantly is supposed to be entering the atmosphere from outer space. So that is pushing back on the atmosphere and wanting to slow it down. And so the common explanation for how the atmosphere keeps up with the surface of the Earth is by friction between the air at the surface. Let me use a red marker for this. There's friction here pushing back on this cubic foot of air down here that's at the surface, and then that's transferred through internal friction, internal shear forces within the fluid, because air is essentially a fluid, okay? It has viscosity, and so these internal shear forces are transferred all the way up throughout the layers of air, right? Just the air pushing against itself. The friction carries that force all the way up to keep the atmosphere moving with the Earth, right? Well, the problem I have with the thing that doesn't make sense to me, and this is why a lot of this is why I ignored it in the first episode, though I didn't explain it, is when you create friction, you create heat. You rub our hands together. It's actually kind of cool here today. Rub my hands together to warm them up. That creates heat. Heat is essentially kinetic energy. And so when something creates heat on the Earth, or when the Earth is heated by the sun, where does that heat go? Well, if you watch Balls Out Physics episode 4.1, I talked about how the accepted explanation for how things don't just get hotter and hotter and hotter is that it radiates out into space, right? So heat from the Earth radiates out into space, into infinite space, and is lost forever. So this process right here, this friction process, the shear force process, creates heat, and that heat is escaping. Therefore, this whole system would be losing energy, wouldn't it? And so we say that heat is really kinetic energy, and kinetic energy is equal to 1/2 mass times velocity squared, right? And so this kinetic energy, I assume, is going down. The kinetic energy of the atmosphere is going down because it's losing heat. And since I hope we're not losing mass to infinite space, not losing our air, that leaves only velocity to go down. So not only does the speed of the air relative to the surface of the Earth have to increase as you go up in elevation, because the path it has to travel, the length of the path, the circumference, increases. we're also have this problem with losing energy. I don't understand how this could work. And that's one thing I've been thinking about. I hadn't really come up with a way to explain it until making this video. So how does this atmosphere keep up with the Earth? And this is why in the very first episode I really was saying, how do planes not go into orbit? Because how does the atmosphere, in a sense, keep up with the Earth? I probably should have made this video first. This increase in velocity that you have to keep up with the Earth doesn't make sense, and then the heat loss to me. Another thing a lot of people have said is you can set the velocity of the Earth equal to 0, right? Because of relativity, we just say that the Earth isn't moving for the plane problem, right? But if VC, right at the ground surface is roughly 0. I mean, it is a little bit above the surface, so it would have to be slightly faster than 0 because its path is slightly longer if you go to the center of a foot. That's just getting too far into it, though. So if we say VC is 0, then VB and VA both have to be greater than 0 to keep up with the Earth, or they'll get left behind in 24 hours. So how does it all work? How do these things blow and move all over the place but still keep up with an Earth that's rotating? How does that work? There's just too much going on. It doesn't really make sense for all this movement to be happening, but us to go outside and experience this relatively stationary air that we experience every day.
Mr. Armstrong, I do realize that when you were on the moon, you had very little time for gazing upwards. But could you tell us something about what the sky actually looks like from the moon, the sun, the earth, the stars, if any, and so on?
The sky is a deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars in the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
Why has nobody been to the moon in such a long time?
That's not an 8-year-old's question. That's my question. I want to know what I think I know. Because we didn't go there, and that's the way it happened.
When you look out into deep space away from the sun, it's the darkest black you can imagine.
And we could not see stars outside the windows. And we could not see stars outside the windows.
I don't remember seeing any.
Rare view of Milwaukee for you. It comes from the other side of Lake Michigan. Now check out this picture. It's of the city lights that were taken last Thursday night in Muskegon, Michigan, some 70 miles away from Milwaukee. So why does Milwaukee look so close? Well, scientists have a name for it, but it's best explained as simply a mirage.
It is cool.
Oh,
I know for Jesse.
that is amazing.
If Jesse Ritker were not off today, she would tell us the exact.
She'd have some more
term
details
they
on
use
that,
for
yes.
that.
So, Oscar, you asked the question, what are some of the easiest ways that you can prove that the Earth is round? Because apparently this is something that we're debating. I have no idea why. That's a hard thing for me to even start talking about, because there are so many proofs that the Earth is round, it's difficult to know where to start. And it's not okay to think that the Earth is flat. This is not a viable argument. I have friends who have been on the International Space Station. They have orbited the Earth once every 90 minutes. You know, I have had personal experience with people that have been up in space and can see with their own eyes that the Earth is round. And of course, we've taken all of these amazing pictures from space. They're so beautiful, all those pictures of the Earth. So I don't really know what's going on right now with this Earth is flat thing, but I will tell you that this is one of the things I really enjoyed teaching my own astronomy class about, because there are proofs all around you. It is not difficult to know that the Earth is round. In fact, people have known this for way more than 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks actually had a number of really elegant, wonderful proofs that the Earth was a sphere. So let's start from the simple to the slightly more complicated. One of the things you can see yourself with a pair of binoculars is if you actually go out to a lake and there are boats on that lake, the farther away a boat is, the more the bottom of the boat will disappear, and you'll basically just see the mast of the boat. And as a boat goes farther and farther away, the last thing you will see is the very top of the mast of that boat. And that's because the boat is actually going over the horizon that's curved. And that means that as it goes farther and farther away, you see less and less of the bottom of it and more of the top of that. You can see that with binoculars, by an ocean, by a lake. It's really easy. That wouldn't happen if the Earth were flat. You would simply see the boat getting smaller and smaller and smaller as it went farther away, but you'd be able to see the whole thing with the same proportions.
Some kind of consciousness raising on my part before I was willing to look at the possibilities. And really, you need to go where the evidence leads.
Let's look at it objectively. Let's look at the evidence, not these fabricated computer models and hearsay and all these predetermined conclusions. Let's really open it up again and investigate this thing properly, and then come to conclusions.
I strongly support an independent investigation that would be independent of the government, independent of all of the influences that obviously were in effect during the NIST investigation.
As we know, the horrors of what happened on 9/11 were televised all over the world, and they were televised, in fact, live. We witnessed the deaths of almost 3,000 of our fellow Americans. We know this had a very severe and traumatic impact on a large majority of the population. At this point, we have 9 years of hard scientific evidence that disproves the government theory about what happened on September 11th, and yet people continue to be either oblivious to the fact that this information exists or completely resistant to looking at this information. So the question becomes why? Why is it that people have so much trouble hearing this information? From my work, I think we would be remiss not to look at the impact of trauma.
Many people respond to these truths in a very deep way. Some have a visceral reaction like they've been punched in the stomach. To begin to accept the possibility that the government was involved is like opening Pandora's box. If you open the lid and peek in a little bit, it's going to challenge some of your fundamental beliefs about the world.
If we can think of our worldview as being sort of our mental and emotional home, I think all of us will do just about anything to defend our homes, to defend our families. And so I see that with people, and I saw that with myself when my brother tried to talk with me about it, of don't mess with me, don't mess with my home, don't mess with my comfort with how things are. About a week later, I read a lengthy article by Professor Griffin about why he believes the official account of 9/11 cannot be true. And it was a very well-researched article. It was in my office at the time. I sat there and I felt my stomach churning. I thought maybe I was going to be sick. And I leaped out of my chair and ran out the door and took a long walk around the block, around several blocks, and just broke down. I understand now that what was happening was my worldview about my government being in some way my protector, almost like a parent, had been dashed, and it was like being cast out into the wilderness, I think is the closest way to describe that feeling. And I sobbed, felt like the ground had completely disappeared beneath my feet. And I knew at some point during the walk that I knew that I was going to have to become active in educating other people about this, that for me to retain any sense of integrity, I was going to have to take some action. I couldn't just let something like this go.
When we hear information that contradicts our worldview, social psychologists call the resulting insecurity cognitive dissonance. For example, with 9/11, we have one cognition, which is what the official story of 9/11, what our government told us, what our media repeated to us over and over, that 19 Muslims attacked us. On the other hand, we have what scientists, researchers, architects, engineers are now beginning to tell us, which is that there is evidence that shows that the official story cannot be true. So now we've lost our sense of security. We are starting to feel vulnerable. Now we're confused.